BBC Surrey is the BBC local radio service covering the English county of Surrey, along with North-East Hampshire and the northern fringes of West Sussex including Crawley, East Grinstead and Gatwick Airport. It began on the 14th of November 1991 under the name BBC Radio Surrey, later becoming part of BBC Southern Counties Radio, before adopting its present name on the 30th of March 2009. Overview. BBC Surrey's studios are based on the campus of the University of Surrey in Guildford. It broadcasts programming specifically for Surrey and North-East Hampshire weekdays from 6 to 9 a.m. and 5 to 6 p.m., and on Saturdays from 6 to 9 a.m. and 2 to 6 p.m. Some other programs broadcast on both BBC Sussex and BBC Surrey are also broadcast from the Guildford studios. There are also dedicated news bulletins for Surrey on the hour at some times of the day. The remainder of the station's output is shared with BBC Sussex. BBC Surrey is transmitted on 104 and 104.6 FM and on DAB via the Muxo Surrey Multiplex, which officially launched on the 12th of December 2013. It has also been available on BBC iPlayer since the 2nd of September 2009. Frequencies: Analog VHF FM 104.0 MHz, Reigate and AMP Crawley 104.6 MHz, Guildford. Analog medium wave AM 1368 kHz, Reigate and AMP Crawley. DAB digital radio, Block 10C 213.36 MHz, Reigate and AMP Crawley, Guildford, South West London, Farnham, Leatherhead. History. BBC Radio Surrey. In the late 1980s, with the BBC local radio network nearing completion, a management team was appointed for BBC Radio Surrey and Berkshire, the plan being to have two separate stations with their own identities but with shared resources and some shared programming. But then in 1990, as part of a plan to save £3 million, the BBC announced that BBC Radio Surrey would instead launch as an opt-out service of BBC Radio Sussex, with BBC Radio Berkshire an opt-out of BBC Radio Oxford. BBC Radio Surrey went on air initially on Saturday the 6th of September 1991 for coverage of a cricket match between Surrey and Hampshire. This was simply a relay of Radio Solent's coverage. The station finally went on air officially at 6 a.m. on Thursday the 14th of November 1991. At launch it broadcast 43 hours a week of its own programming, from its studios on the campus of the University of Surrey in Guildford. The remainder of the output came from either its sister station BBC Radio Sussex, or from the BBC South and AMP East network. Just over a week after launch, BBC Radio Surrey presented its first Children in Need programme, and breakfast presenter John Terrett and travel reporter Christina King also made a brief appearance on the southeast section of the television coverage. However, the station was to receive little more in the way of promotion thereafter. Over its 2 years on air, BBC Radio Surrey struggled to build a substantial audience. In fact, audience figures reached a maximum of only 29,000, or 7% reach, in 1993. One factor in this was that the output was broadcast by only one transmitter at Guildford, covering West Surrey on 104.6 FM, meaning listeners in East Surrey could not hear the station properly. Another was the fact that the county's ILR stations were already long established, making it difficult for the new station to establish itself. John Terrett hosted the breakfast show from launch, which featured regular reports from the station's own dedicated travel presenter Christina King. It was followed by Julian Cleck's mid-morning phone-in, which was simulcast with BBC Radio Sussex, although news and travel bulletins were split between the two stations every hour throughout the day. The joint output avoided mentioning the name of either station. Instead, full use was made of split jingles. At midday, Steve Watts hosted the hour-long What's for Lunch, which featured celebrity guests, local topics, and the weather wardens, made up of listener correspondents from across the county, who also brought unusual facts and history about their corner of Surrey. Following Miranda Birch's consumer show from Brighton, the final daily programme from Guildford was Drive Time with Claire Paul. Although since she was also station editor, she was absent from the show more often than not. Charles Carroll, Mike Carson, and Radio Sussex's Stuart McIntosh were the usual stand-ins. In the early days, Christina King also presented travel reports during this show as well. There were 3 weekend programs from Guildford: Steve Watts's light-hearted Saturday show, which included a pub team quiz, the religious program Sunday Best, and Nick Simmons's laid-back Sunday morning show of music and chat. In October 1992, John Terrett and Claire Paul left, Sir Stuart McIntosh took over the lunchtime show, and Tim Humphrey moved to breakfast, while Steve Watts moved to drive time. Jonathan Wills, later a presenter on ITV's London Tonight, joined the station, first as a travel presenter, before moving on to news reading and then sports presenting. During 1993, Phil Kennedy became a regular stand-in on BBC Radio Surrey's drive time and lunch time shows. Following schedule changes in July 1993, BBC Radio Surrey was gradually wound down. From September, the station was identified on-air as BBC Radio Sussex and Surrey, although some programmes remained split between the two counties. The merger was complete on the 7th of January 1994, when BBC Radio Sussex and Surrey officially became a single station. BBC Southern Counties Radio on the 1st of August 1994. The station's name was changed to BBC Southern Counties Radio. At first it ran a single all-talk schedule across Sussex and Surrey. However, in September 1997, a dedicated breakfast show for Surrey was reintroduced, followed by a drive time show in April 2006. Apart from a brief period in 2006, the former BBC Radio Sussex transmitter at Reigate on 104.0 FM was now used for the Surrey output, in order to give better reception for listeners in East Surrey. BBC Surrey, the county name, returned to the radio station's name on the 30th of March 2009, when BBC Surrey became the new name for BBC Southern Counties Radio across Surrey, North-East Hampshire and Crawley, broadcasting on 104.0 and 104.6 FM. BBC Surrey and its sister station BBC Sussex continue effectively to operate as one station, with no change in management or infrastructure from its predecessor. Networked and simulcast programming. During off-peak hours, BBC Surrey also carries regional programming for the South and South East regions, produced from sister stations BBC Radio Solent and BBC Radio Kent. As with all BBC local radio stations, it also airs the network weekday evening shows, originating from BBC Radio Leeds and produced independently by Wirefree Productions. During the station's downtime, BBC Surrey simulcasts BBC Radio 5 live overnight.